American Revolution, Battle of Lexington and Concord, 1775. In the year 1775, the expansive landscapes of North America became the backdrop for a burgeoning conflict, beginning with the initial confrontation at Lexington and culminating in the decisive battles at Yorktown. The 13 colonies found themselves at a crossroads, torn between loyalty to the British Crown and the pursuit of liberty and self-governance. This narrative encapsulates the emergence of the American Revolution. Embark on an exploration of the critical battles, tactical strategies, and political transformations that paved the way for the establishment of a new nation. More than 150 years prior to the first shots fired at Lexington, European nations commenced their colonization of the Americas, founding settlements in locations such as Jamestown and Quebec. By the 1750s, these colonies had matured from mere trading outposts into intricate societies, each striving for supremacy among European powers. The British colonists carried with them a deep-rooted tradition of democracy and essential rights, shaped by centuries of strife and insurrection. A notable portion of landowners existed within their ranks, with 60% of the male European populace in the colonies possessing the right to vote, a significant divergence from the situation in Britain. Most colonies were governed by appointed or elected royal officials, whose power was moderated by local representative assemblies and councils. Elected assemblies dealt with a variety of matters, including local taxation and militia funding. However, Parliament in London imposed new laws, including tax regulations, asserting its absolute authority over the colonies. The onset of the 7 Years' War in 1756 marked a significant shift, turning North America into a conflict zone between Great Britain and France. Both nations heavily depended on Native American allies, yet it was the colonial militias that were instrumental in achieving British victories and influencing their future in the region. Despite Britain's triumph, it incurred a substantial financial burden, leading to the expectation that the colonies would contribute to this expense. Many in Britain, believing that the colonists were represented in Parliament by virtue of their British citizenship, felt no obligation to consult colonial governments regarding the methods of raising these funds. This perspective incited outrage among the colonists, who perceived themselves as being taxed without representation, a sentiment echoed by William Pitt, Britain's wartime leader during the 7 Years' War, who famously stated in 1766 that the kingdom had no right to impose taxes on the colonies. This situation could not persist indefinitely. If it did not change, it would necessitate drastic measures. In the colonies, discontent grew over the imposition of new taxes without their consent. While a number of individuals remained loyal to King George III, they believed that their rights as Englishmen, including the right to local representation, were being overlooked by a distant and indifferent Parliament located thousands of miles away. As tensions escalated throughout the 1760s, the situation became increasingly fraught. Anger and resistance towards Parliament's encroachment began to rise throughout the colonies. In 1767, the British government in London aimed to reinforce its control over the American colonies through a series of initiatives known as the Townshend Acts. These measures were intended not only to generate essential revenue, but also to establish a foundation for future legislation that would promote the colonies' financial independence. However, what was meant to be a show of authority quickly transformed into a spark for insurrection. The colonists perceived these acts as yet another infringement on their rights, leading to intense opposition. Tensions escalated dramatically in Boston, where protests evolved into violent confrontations. In an effort to restore order, British authorities sent regular troops to safeguard local officials. The situation became increasingly volatile, culminating in a tragic incident. An agitated crowd incited the soldiers to discharge their weapons, resulting in the deaths of 5 colonists. This tragic occurrence would later be remembered as the Boston Massacre. Although the soldiers were subsequently withdrawn from the city, the roots of resentment had firmly established themselves. By 1773, discontent simmered just below the surface, poised to erupt. Frustrated by regulations that undermined the value of smuggled tea, Bostonians took a bold stand against British rule. Disguised as Native Americans, they boarded vessels belonging to the East India Company and defiantly cast an astonishing 9,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. This audacious act of defiance reverberated throughout Britain and sparked further indignation among colonial leaders. In response, the British government implemented the Intolerable Acts, a series of punitive measures aimed at punishing Massachusetts and reasserting dominance over the colonies. These severe laws effectively dismantled Massachusetts' self-governance and subjected it to direct British authority. Contrary to suppressing dissent, these measures only fueled resistance throughout the colonies. In October 1774, representatives from various colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to formulate a collective response. While the majority of delegates were reluctant to break away from the Crown, an increasing number of patriots passionately pushed for independence. Determined to challenge Parliament's overreach, Congress decided to boycott British goods until the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. In Boston, more radical developments occurred as the disbanded Colonial Assembly evolved into the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which began organizing militias in preparation for potential armed conflict. As tensions heightened, British officials declared Massachusetts to be in a state of open rebellion. General Thomas Gage, assigned the task of restoring order in Boston, faced significant challenges. Having previously fought alongside colonists such as George Washington in earlier conflicts, he was well acquainted with the local terrain, yet he recognized that many of his 4,000 troops had never engaged in combat. From his headquarters in Boston, General Gage initiated his plans. Regular patrols were conducted throughout Massachusetts with the intention of demonstrating strength and enhancing troop morale. However, despite his objectives, he had no inclination towards war. His aim was to avert conflict through rapid raids designed to capture or destroy military supplies held by colonial militias. Unfortunately, these initiatives frequently had the opposite effect. Instead of quelling dissent, they inadvertently fortified the resolve and organization of the colonists. As tensions escalated, encounters between British regulars and colonial forces remained predominantly non-lethal, marked by intense verbal exchanges and sporadic physical altercations. Yet, with each passing day, it became increasingly evident that a confrontation between Parliament and its increasingly rebellious colonies was on the horizon. The British regulars had become accustomed to observing armed militia demonstrations, a typical aspect of colonial life, where locals asserted their rights as Englishmen rather than posing a threat of violence. However, in March 1775, the more radical Massachusetts Provincial Congress took a significant step, declaring that any substantial British force departing from Boston would face armed opposition. Concurrently, General Thomas Gage received escalatory directives from a resolute government in London to disarm the colonial militias and detain their leaders, setting both factions on a path toward conflict. In response, Gage formulated a strategy to apprehend the rebel leadership and seize considerable military supplies in the nearby town of Concord. He assembled a contingent of 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, instructing him to honor the rights of local residents and their private property, while also advising him to call for reinforcements if they encountered resistance. Unbeknownst to Gage, the Massachusetts rebels had foreseen such an action. On the eve of the raid, patriots became aware of the British intentions in Boston and set out to alert the leadership of Congress and local militias, narrowly escaping detection by British patrols. Due to the land route to Concord being closely observed by rebel sympathizers, Smith's contingent opted to cross the bay in the early hours of April 19th, with the objective of preserving the element of surprise. They landed in waist-deep water and commenced their 18-mile trek to Concord. By approximately 2 a.m., their boots were thoroughly soaked. Anticipating a lack of resistance that would facilitate rapid movement, each soldier carried only a limited supply of ammunition, a choice that would later have dire consequences. As they advanced, colonial riders were observed heading west in front of Smith's column. Reports soon reached him from forward units indicating that large militia forces were assembling at Lexington, unsettling news that quickly circulated among his troops. Recognizing that they had forfeited the vital element of surprise, Smith dispatched a message back to Boston requesting reinforcements. Upon the arrival of British forces in Lexington, they encountered the town's militia, which was present but not obstructing the road to Concord or intending to engage in combat. The militia, consisting of approximately 80 men and led by John Parker, stood prepared but sought to prevent bloodshed. Parker instructed his men to maintain their positions and not to fire unless they were fired upon. If a war is to be waged, let it commence here. Without directives from their superiors, a British advance guard proceeded to Lexington Common rather than continuing their march toward Concord. Both factions urged their soldiers to refrain from firing, and Parker's militia was instructed to disperse. As tensions escalated, curious onlookers assembled. Local spectators observed as hostilities were exchanged between the two groups. Just as the militiamen began to withdraw, a solitary shot rang out from the vicinity of the common, a shot that would resonate throughout history. In the ensuing chaos, gunfire erupted from both sides until British troops discharged their weapons in a volley without receiving orders. Unbeknownst to those present, the first casualties had occurred in what would later be recognized as the American Revolutionary War, with 8 militiamen lying dead on Lexington Common. Amid the turmoil, Smith regained control of his troops and chastised his bewildered officers for their lack of discipline, reminding them of Gage's commands. The troops were recalled, and their march resumed toward Concord. The day was still early, and Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith aimed to salvage their mission despite the unexpected setback at Lexington. Upon reaching Concord, the British troops conducted searches of buildings where residents allowed entry, incinerating any contraband they encountered. However, they found no rebel leaders or significant military supplies. The rebels had removed any valuable items hours prior. By 9 a.m., approximately 400 colonial militia had assembled in the nearby hills under the leadership of Colonel Barrett. Rumors of the events at Lexington had reached them, and they now witnessed smoke ascending from Concord. Believing that the regulars were incinerating the town, many individuals were incensed by this apparent escalation and prepared to respond in kind. Meanwhile, the weary British regulars resting in Concord remained oblivious to the significant shift in public sentiment and the growing numbers of militia encircling their position. Watched by evacuated residents, Barrett and his militia were determined to protect their community. They swiftly dislodged the 90 regulars stationed at the bridge, but momentarily taken aback by both their success and the intensifying situation, they retreated to regroup on the hill. As over 1,000 militia surrounded Concord, Smith recognized that it was time to withdraw. The regulars dispersed beyond the road for protection and commenced their march back toward Lexington. However, columns of militia ominously trailed their movements, igniting a race to reach the first bridge. The circumstances had dramatically shifted for Smith and his forces. They found themselves dangerously outnumbered and far from the safety of Boston Harbor. Gunfire erupted as casualties mounted among the regulars crossing the bridge. British skirmishers attempted to flank the militia, who had strategically positioned themselves behind walls, trees, and underbrush. Those exposed in the open were killed, but the majority of militiamen had spent years traversing North America's rugged landscape and delivered disciplined, effective musket fire before repositioning. As desperation propelled their advance, the regulars faced repeated ambushes from a now 2,000-strong militia, leading to a continued rise in casualties. British tactical formations struggled in the wooded terrain, and their limited ammunition began to diminish. They attempted to spread out where feasible, but at constricted points, such as the notorious Bloody Angle, discipline and cohesion started to erode as they fought for their survival. The Lexington militia, led by Parker, who had been dispersed by British troops merely 8 hours prior, was now reassembled and poised for retribution. Parker positioned his men on a wooded hill that overlooked the road. As they commenced firing, Lieutenant Colum Smith was hit in the leg and fell from his horse, sustaining a wound. The sun remained low in the sky when fierce combat erupted outside of Lexington, where the British, exhausted from 14 hours of continuous marching and fighting, were on the verge of capitulation. Lieutenant Colum Francis Smith and his beleaguered troops stumbled into the town, defeated not only by the superior tactics of the colonial militia, but also by their resilience and overwhelming numbers. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm them, a sudden cheer surged through the British ranks. Smith's urgent request for reinforcements had been fulfilled. Under the leadership of Earl Percy, 1,000 British regulars now surround Lexington, accompanied by 2 powerful field guns. Percy quickly assumed command, reorganizing Smith's battered forces and re-establishing control over the situation. However, the battle was far from concluded. Despite the reinforcements, the British found themselves significantly outnumbered by a burgeoning militia that had swelled to 4,000 strong, undeterred by the arrival of fresh troops. Percy continued to advance with Smith's weary column at the center. Meanwhile, Militia General William Heath arrived to take command of the colonial forces. Heath swiftly recognized the threat posed by the British field guns and instructed his men to avoid large formations. Instead, his forces would engage in a series of rotations along the road, a complex and demanding maneuver. As the British column faced increasing monotony, intense street fighting broke out, resulting in brutal hand-to-hand confrontations. In their desperation, some British soldiers resorted to committing atrocities while systematically clearing buildings of sharpshooters. The ensuing chaos resulted in casualties on both sides, including a valiant militiaman who lost his life defending his home, asserting defiantly that an Englishman's home is his castle. While substantial militia forces were positioned at Cambridge, Percy opted to advance toward Charlestown, cautious of potential traps that could jeopardize his men. After overcoming the last vestiges of militia resistance on the final hill, the British column staggered into Charlestown, ultimately reaching the safety provided by Boston Harbor and its Royal Navy gunners. The first battle of the American Revolution had come to an end. Although the casualties were relatively low for both sides, the significance of the battle was profound. The war had officially commenced. Patriot leader John Adams later reflected on this crucial moment. In the wake of the battle, amidst a sense of upheaval, trenches and redoubts emerged around Boston as it came under siege. In the ensuing days and weeks, volunteers from all 13 colonies rushed to enlist in the Army, transforming local militias into a unified American force for the first time. Despite lacking modern equipment and training, they achieved victory in their initial confrontation against British forces. General Gage's attempt to prevent conflict ultimately proved disastrous, mirroring the British government's strategy of enforcing compliance without the consent of their colonial subjects. In London, Parliament quickly redirected blame towards Gage for what they characterized as the initiation of a civil conflict, despite his actions being in accordance with their directives. Even as reports of gunfire in Lexington reverberated worldwide, Parliament remained resolute in its stance. British reinforcements were sent to suppress what they viewed as an insurrection. What had initially started as civil discussions regarding rights and taxation had escalated into full-scale war in Massachusetts. Although this initial confrontation concluded with a colonial victory, it served merely as an introduction to the larger conflict. The British would soon respond with increased determination. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. You can watch our previous videos titled The Native American Sharpshooter, the role of George Washington as a commander-in-chief, the aftermath of Hiroshima explosion, the shocking story about General Custer's ending, the Battle of Berlin, Africa's bloodiest civil war, IBB coup, 1985, the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, etc.